So without further ado, Amanda and Gina, it is all yours.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I hope everybody is staying warm. Today, you guys are going to get some more information and learn about behavior and communication and how they are like peanut butter and jelly. My name is Amanda. I am the itinerant intervention specialist for the EP program with the AIU 3. And my lovely co-presenter is Gina, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Gina, and I'm a speech language pathologist for AIU3. I work with equitable participation and also work countywide for diagnostic support.
So today we are going to learn about how behavior and communication interact. So for some of you that came last year and learned about behavior functions, we're going to reiterate some of that today, but also we're going to expand on it and find out how communication plays into that role. So, oh, there we go. There's our AIU mission and vision. And then we're going to go into our objectives. So today we're going to increase our understanding and application with the relationship between behavior and communication, our ABC sequence, how speech and language skills influence behavior, the functions of behaviors, behavior and communication antecedent strategies, FERBs or functional equivalent replacement behaviors, supporting language development in the classroom, and then our behavior and communication consequence interventions. So, go ahead, Gina.
We're going to get started with just a couple of questions. Please either unmute or put your answers in the chat. These are questions that will be answered throughout the presentation, but I want to start with getting what everyone thinks. So first of all, what comes to mind when you think communication? What are some of the things you think about when you think of communication? Okay, expressing thoughts. Thank you, Anne. Body language. Thanks, Holly. Tone.
I personally love that someone mentioned the nonverbal side.
Yes,
that body language. Yes.
Everyone knows it's going to be a trick question. It's not just speaking. I'm glad everyone is keeping that in mind. Letting me know your needs. Thank you, Alexa. Okay. And I see there's still some typing. I'll mention that if it comes through, but I'll go on to the next question, which is, can you advance the slide, Amanda?
Oh, sorry. Yep.
That's okay. I forgot that I can't do it.
That's okay, me. You'll have to monitor the chat because I can't see the chat.
What do you think about when you think behavior? Acting in a way that makes sense to you, a nonverbal type of communication. Okay. Thanks, Anne and Alexa, again for participating. Reaction to something. How to appropriately respond in a situation. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. These are some really great answers.
A+, because usually when people hear behavior, they immediately go towards the more maladaptive ones. So I love that you guys already started to kind of focus on the positive side. So that's great.
And any thoughts about how those two are connected? And based on the answers so far, we might not even need to do the presentation. Okay, Hannah, behavior is a form of communication. You spoiled the whole thing.
We're just going to hand it over to you.
Good job, Hannah. In order to appropriately excuse me, in order to appropriately respond, you need to be able to communicate appropriately. Yes, another great response there. Okay, that's some awesome responses. Thank you, everyone. So here we just have some word webs of some things that apply to communication and behavior. This is by no means a comprehensive list. After I made these, I started thinking of a bunch of others that I didn't add. But as everyone pointed out, when it comes to communication, you know, we have speaking, of course. That's probably the first thing we think of, but there's so much more to it. Body language, waving, smiling, laughing. Some people use sign language to communicate in addition to or instead of speaking. Some people who are unable to use speech will use a speech generating device where they can touch symbols or type words and the device will output the information. Even things like music are communication, even though it's not necessarily language based. And then, do you want to talk about the behavior one, Amanda?
Sure. And as
Just
for
briefly.
behavior, I mean, it's a response. It's any way that we interact with our environment. Crying, taking deep breaths, it's things that are observed and can be measured. So walking, whispering, writing, taking a drink, interacting with other people. It's all of those things that we do with others and interact. So as long as you're moving, grooving, and doing something, that's a behavior. And it can obviously fall into two categories, things that we deem appropriate or inappropriate.
And sorry.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, and some of these things overlap. So speaking is something that is being done in the environment that can be measured. So speaking is a behavior, although there is a lot that goes on under the hood that we need to think about as well. Writing is a behavior. That's another way we communicate as well. And just to reiterate, we know behavior and communication go together.
So funny thing about the presentation, I love to sprinkle memes and GIFs throughout the presentation. And when Gina and I went to do this together, she matches my weird energy. So she jumped right in and added a bunch more. So I love it. So I hope you guys are ready for some weird humor. So anyway, behavior and communication, they are the perfect match because we know that when you are able to communicate your wants and needs, you're easier to have more acceptable and appropriate behavior in your environment. However, when you do have difficulty communicating your wants and needs, you're more likely to see an increase in that maladaptive or what we do inappropriate behavior. It's still communication. You're still talking with people and telling them. It's just in a way that we don't find as appropriate in our eyes. But someone aggressing or eloping, they're still communicating. It's just not in a way that we would want them to.
So why behavior and communication? This slide is going to kind of reiterate what Amanda just stated. But generally, behavior is used to communicate. And one of the many ways we communicate is with speech or language. And in a lot of ways, this is one of the more effective ways to communicate. So when students have difficulty with speech or language, it can be difficult for them to find a way to communicate their needs effectively. In addition, students with language impairments are more likely to also have impairments with behavior regulation skills, like emotional regulation, inhibiting responses, so not doing something they're not supposed to, attending to their environment. And language impairments can also overlap with disorders like autism or ADHD that also lead to behavioral problems sometimes. I do want to emphasize, because sometimes when I talk about behavior being communication and communication being behavior, it can sometimes get misconstrued as every behavior problem is a speech or language problem. And that's not necessarily the case. I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide how language and communication overlap but are not exactly the same thing. But what this does mean is that when we have a student who's presenting with maladaptive behaviors, communication and speech and language skills are something we have to take into consideration to make sure that we're using the appropriate interventions to help with the behavior problem.
So behavior is anything a person does, just like we said. It's not just problem behavior. The way we behave is meaningful for us in our environment because it serves a purpose. But for us, when we're talking about behavior, it's something that is observable and measurable in an interaction with the environment. So examples, like we said, walking, talking, dancing, sitting, reading, these can all be measured. Reading, you can measure by words, duration, how long they were reading for. The way that behaviorists test is if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So some people are always like, oh, we use noncompliance. You're correct. If you say just noncompliant, a dead man can be noncompliant because they could just lay on the floor. So that's why it's very important that when we talk about behavior, we have to make sure that we're defining it appropriately, because physical aggression to one person could mean one thing, and physical aggression to another person could mean something completely else. So we want to make sure that when we're defining behavior, it's defined to the point where everyone can understand what it means. So then we get into communication versus speech versus language.
Yes. So this has a lot to do with what is the difference between the observable behavior and the skills and the neural networks that are going on in our brain. So communication is the behavior. Communication is any behavior that is done to transfer a message from one person to another. As a lot of you pointed out in your answers to my first question, communication doesn't require speech and language. It can include it and often does, but there's many other forms of communication. For those of us with fur babies, they can't talk, they don't have language, but they can definitely communicate with us. We know the difference between their different barks and meows and what they mean. So that's an example of communicating in a way that's not language. And next I'm going to talk about speech. Speech is also behavioral. It's the sounds that come out of our mouth that we are using, our articulators, so our lips, our tongue, our voice box, to produce different sounds and putting them together to create the words and the language that we want to communicate. And then language is the cognitive processes that allow us to speak or write in a way that can be understood by others who use the same language as us. So language is the patterns in our brain that represent how we communicate with the world. It includes structure, so that includes structure would be how we produce the sounds, as well as grammar and sentence structure, meaning, understanding what different words mean, and context, knowing when and how to use language. And then I just want to note that I'm talking about speech because it's the most common, but when we think about people who are in the deaf or hard of hearing community who use sign language is also a complete language. So their signs would be the equivalent of the spoken speech that we use. And then I have a little Venn diagram to kind of visualize these differences. Can you advance the slide, Amanda? So language is the mental knowledge and understanding we have. Speech is the output. It requires adequate structures and the ability to use the appropriate motor patterns to produce our speech. Communication can be non-linguistic, unlike language. And then how language and communication overlap. Obviously, language is used to communicate. Communication and speech are both behavioral. Speech relies on our knowledge of the sound system and our motor plans in our brain. And then all together, they come together and they allow us to transfer thoughts and ideas from one person to another.
So then behavior, communication, or language. So when you're looking at these, of course, there's my funny meme. When you're looking at them, I gotta slide this down a little bit. You can sit and figure out which one is which. So looking at one, using a class hand signal to ask for a drink of water. What do you guys think? I can't see the chat, so you'll have to tell me.
I will.
Okay. Any brave souls out there?
And it can be more than one.
Thank you. Yes. Or if you see a different one on the list that you want to answer for.
Okay, so I see communication. Yes, it is a form of communication. And then Anne said B and C, so behavior and communication. Yes.
How how about we'll jump to punching someone? I'll give you an easy one. But it also might be a trick question.
It might be. Depends on how you think about it. Michelle said also behavior and communication. Same with Anne.
Yes.
Yeah. It might not be intentional communication, but it is communicating something, and probably that they don't like the other person.
Right. So with these, we're kind of just giving you one little example, but you also have to take into context and a couple of other things.
Yes.
And then
exactly.
I'll ask this one too, verbally answering a question. How about that one?
Communication. BCL, yes. And it's all three.
Yep. So it's really cool when you think about these, what they all can actually pull in, that when it's very easy to be like, oh, that's behavior, oh, that's talking, oh, it's communication, speech, language. But once you really start thinking of how they are all interconnected, it's much more in depth than just something as simple as, oh, they're just talking. Oh, they're just a behavior. So it kind of gets you really thinking. So, oh, hang on, my thing's moving around again. There we go. So sometimes when we're trying to understand the behavior of some people, it's like trying to smell the color 9. It's just really, really hard because we have to take into consideration so many things, and it's really difficult. So the way we break apart when we're looking at behaviors, there's 3 parts to everything. So we have our antecedent, our behavior, and our consequence. And I break them all down into the antecedent. We're going to get behavior heavy. So if I start talking too fast, just you guys let me know. Gina, you tell me in the chat if something comes in to tell me to slow down. So the antecedent is something in the environment that signals to the student that there's reinforcement available based on their behavior. So the antecedent is something that happens right before a behavior occurs. So I like to stress with everybody, say it with me, there is no such thing as no antecedent. This is when I love that people tell me it came out of nowhere. The behavior happened for no reason. No, something happened. We might not have just caught it yet. Or maybe it didn't happen where we saw it, or we don't know what's going on. So some antecedents that can happen in the environment to students are some demands. So directives to the student, task presentation, bell rings, people start talking to you, and then non-demands, you're hungry and you see a snack or seeing a friend. Antecedents also take into account motivation. So I'm more likely to maybe work for something if I know a snack is my reward when I'm done, if I'm not hungry, or if I'm hungry. If I'm not hungry, I'm less likely to work for it. So if the student doesn't want what we're offering, they're probably not going to be they're not going to work hard enough for it. The other thing is we also have to take into account setting events. So these are general conditions that are earlier occurrences that might make someone more likely to engage in behavior. So if they're sick or tired, we know that someone is less likely to do what we would like them to do. If they've had a fight with a family member, antecedents are not diagnoses, medical conditions, or setting events. These are outside of what is going on. And then a consequence. There are 2 types of consequences. In the behavior world, I know, or outside of the behavior world, people think of consequence as something bad that comes after. But in the ABC chain in the behavior world, it is just the 3rd part, and it's just what comes immediately after the behavior occurs. There's reinforcement, which is an event that follows a behavior and increases the future frequency of the occurrence of the behavior, or punishment is something that decreases the future frequency of the behavior. So I have a lot of people that are like, well, I was giving him reinforcement, but the behavior is continuing to decrease. Then that means whatever you were giving him was probably not reinforcing. So even though you like Reese's peanut butter cups, it doesn't mean that that student liked Reese's peanut butter cups. Okay? And those things kind of it gets difficult sometimes. So this is one of my favorite memes. I put this in everywhere. It just happens out of the blue. Nope, all behavior serves a function. It's our job as the behavior detectives to figure out why it's happening.
Okay. And then, so how does speech and language come into this? How does speech and language impact the behavior of a student? When I think about how speech and language impact behavior, I am reminded of when I was in college. I my sophomore year, I took a Chinese class. The class was taught entirely in Chinese, and I had no prior experience with the Chinese language. Everyone else in my class took Chinese in high school. So, I was an adult. I chose to take the class. I studied my Chinese. That was my homework ahead of time. But it was still the most difficult class I've ever taken, and I was very confused and stressed out when I was in that course. Students with language disorders kind of feel like that in the classroom. Maybe not to the same extent because they have some understanding of English, depending on how severe the disability is. But imagine, you're in a classroom and you're just having so much trouble understanding what's being taught because of your language disability. So this can cause a lot of frustration and confusion, which can lead to anxiety, which can then lead to a maladaptive behavior that we don't want to see. In addition, if a student has difficulty with speech, it makes them difficult to understand. They can try to use their speech to communicate, and then when the other person doesn't understand them and it doesn't work, once again, that might lead to a maladaptive behavior in order for them to get what they want. Or speaking might just be so difficult for the student that throwing their book across the room is actually a lot easier than trying to say that they need help. And then I also want you to think about how one of the components of language is pragmatic language. So that's the social use of language. So when students don't understand how to use language socially, it can make it difficult for them to know how to engage with peers in order to receive relationship and attention, and it can make it difficult for them to communicate with teachers for the same reason. So in order to receive attention, rather than trying to join play or a conversation, they don't know how. So they might do something that you don't want them to do instead because they know that will get them attention. And then I just want to add a little bit of a note about the stress response. I'm talking about students who have significant weaknesses or disabilities in speech and language. But for those who are typically developing, even adults, think about a time when you were really, really stressed out, and think about how hard or easy it was for you to verbally explain the situation to someone in that moment. When we are in a fight, flight, or freeze response, higher level cognition, including language skills, are very difficult. So if you have a student who is frequently stressed out, has a history of trauma, is in that fight, flight, or freeze response a lot, when they're in that response, some of the strategies we're going to talk about that are alternative communications other than speaking that can help students might also help these students as well who are in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, even if they don't have a speech or language disorder.
So functions of behavior tell us why an individual engages in the behavior. Again, every behavior has a function. Nothing is random or happens for no reason. So again, we need to remember, setting events include those feelings, anxiety, mental health diagnoses. So whenever we're thinking about those go back to those setting events. Happens before the behavior occurs, and we take those into consideration as well. So when we're talking about the functions of behavior, it's EATS. I like this meme because it really breaks down escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. And of course, everyone laughs at the sensory dog because that's gross and funny at the same time. So the first one we talk about, the easy way to remember this is everyone eats. Sometimes we do take a seat, but eats is the order of that meme, so that's how I'm doing it today. So escape. Behavior can be maintained by escape or avoidance of a non-preferred or aversive activities. So I joke around that last night I did laundry, I talked to my mom on the phone, or I even did dishes to avoid having to work on this presentation, which is actually funny because I hate doing the dishes and I will do anything I can to avoid doing the dishes. I even joke that I had it put in my wedding vows because I will do anything not to do the dishes. I would rather clean the toilets. So yes, escape. Think of our kids that just do not like to do work, or their sensory things that bother them. They're trying to get out of it. The next one is attention. This behavior is maintained because they're trying to gain access from attention from others. So an interaction can function as attention. So that includes, don't forget, our body language, eye contact, eye gaze, body orientation, facial expressions. I love when someone will tell me, well, I don't give them any attention, but when something happens, this is what I see. Because that's 100% attention. Commenting, physical blocking, moving items around or prompting to clean up, those are all acts of attention. Access to tangibles, this one's pretty self-explanatory. The behaviors occurred by gaining access or maintaining access to something that they want. Physical items, edibles, snacks, or activities. And then the last one is sensory. And to be honest with you, this is one of the hardest ones to counteract, just because if it comes from within, a lot of our kids have that internal stimulatory behaviors, where hand flapping or spitting or vocal, auditory, those ones are really hard to help find replacement behavior, because if it comes from within, it's kind of hard to withhold that because they have all of that fun stuff built right within. But this is one that is maintained by access to sensory stimulation. So when you think about sight, sound, taste, physical feelings, smells, and for us, like, I don't know about you guys, but after I have a really hard day and I'm driving home, I do car karaoke at the top of my lungs. Nobody ever wants to hear that. But that's what makes me kind of cope with my rough day. So we all have sensory stimulations, but it's just that, I know when to do it and when not to. So it's all fun and games until someone figures out the function of our behaviors, because then, of course, that leads to our appropriate function-based interventions. So we need to think about, for our students, yes, do our students need to learn how to live in the real world? 100%. Everybody does. The world doesn't revolve around us. We need to find our place in it. But for our students, if what they had was working, they wouldn't be needing our help at this point in time. So it's our job to modify our behavior to help them learn their correct replacement behaviors. So we modify based on the function of the behavior to minimize their access to reinforcement for the problem behavior. We then teach them the replacement appropriate behavior, and we reinforce that appropriate replacement behavior. So we start with antecedent interventions. So these are all the good things that happen before a behavior occurs. So we pair with that individual. We let them know that we're a safe, calming place for them. We approach behavior. We have instructional control. We let them know work is not a punishment. Work is something that we have to do. But you know what? When we're done with that, we can still have some fun. We have environmental arrangement. We structure the space and the schedule to minimize opportunity for those problem behaviors to occur. And there's a big difference between choices and control. I'm not saying that we can give choices throughout the entire day. There are some things that you have to do. You have to do math and you have to do ELA and you have to go to gym and you have to do things. But you know what? If you're teaching math, is it really a big deal if you do this worksheet or this worksheet first? Or if you're in math class and you have to work on a certain something, does it matter where you sit? Like, pick your battles. And it's just those little controlled choices that you can offer to a student that allows them to have some feeling of empowerment and control about their day. Because when you think about how long the day is, and when you're in school, how many choices do kids actually have? Some days at lunch, you don't even get to pick what you have for lunch. You just have to eat. You get what you get and you don't get upset. So these are all small things that you can do before problem behavior to help decrease that opportunity. And here's a list based on functions of the behavior. We just talked about attention. You can give them more time, provide positive attention, or provide attention for positive behaviors. Escape, breaking tasks down into smaller tasks. Access attention, tangibles, giving choices, giving them more opportunities to access those items before the problem behaviors. Sensory, giving them sensory breaks, giving them more items to have those times with, teaching them how to request those items, all of those great things. And then, of course, there are the SL accommodations.
Yeah, so there's also some speech and language accommodations that you can have within your classroom to help to reduce the potential for maladaptive behaviors. So because students are, you're supporting their speech and language needs. So the first one is using visuals and multisensory supports in instruction. On the next slide, I have some pictures and examples of this, so I'll go more in depth there. Try to face the student when you're speaking. Having additional cues from your facial expressions, as well as being able to see your lips and mouth, can be helpful in helping them to understand. Use clear, direct language, especially when giving new instructions that aren't usually part of your classroom routine. You want to think about not using really long sentences or using too much figurative language. So I like to tell teachers the more verbs the sentence has, the more complex it is. A lot of times we'll say things like, can you put the pencil away? But adding the can you at the beginning can make the sentence more complex. So just think about if you're giving directions with a complex sentence, like after you color in the worksheet, put it in your cubby, you can say that because we still want to expose students to these different types of sentence structures, but follow it up with then also a simplified version, either directly to a student if you know they have difficulty or to the whole class. So you can start with, after you color the paper, put it in your cubby, and then following that, say, first color the paper, then put it in your cubby. And you can even use some visuals or multisensory supports like a first then sheet to help support that as well. And try to keep in mind if you're using figurative language or non-literal language, students with language disabilities have a lot of difficulty with this. And also students in lower elementary grades developmentally, they have difficulty with this, even if they're typically developing students. So once again, that doesn't mean don't use figurative language because we want the exposure. But if you notice you're saying something like, instead of sit down, you're saying pop a squat, follow it up with also sit down so that every student is clear about what you're saying. Repeat and rephrase key instructions. That's pretty self-explanatory. Allow alternate responses other than verbal speech. So try to incorporate things into the class, like you answering a question and having students give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or them doing gestures. If you're talking about different types of animals, they can do a gesture based on which animal they're responding about. This allows students to participate more when they have trouble communicating verbally. Pre-teach key vocabulary for lessons. This is helpful for all students, but can be especially helpful for students with language disabilities. And then be responsive to all types of communication to anticipate needs. So try to get to know some of the things your students might do. That's a sign that they might be becoming upset. I used to work with a student who, right before he flew off the handle, he would start laughing. And at first I thought he was having a good time, but then I started to see the pattern. I knew when he was laughing, it was time to take a break, have him use one of his coping skills, and then get back to the work after he's calmed down. And here's some pictures of some different visuals and multisensory supports you can use in the classroom. You can use things like gestures for asking for basic needs. This can be really helpful for the whole classroom because then instead of having kids raise their hands and ask for things, they can just quietly sit there, with their hand up for water. Using visual schedules. A lot of you probably already have this up on your board, but if you know there's a student who particularly struggles, they might need a visual schedule on their desk closer to them to help them to know what to expect. Having visuals for common instructions, like visuals for cutting, visuals for writing. And in the middle picture, you can see you can either do 1 through 4, or if the student needs it more simplified, you can use a first then sheet where you put the first part of the task, the next part of the task. Once the student completes that, you swap them out for the next 2 parts. Total physical response. This is a strategy taken actually from teaching second languages, but this just means getting your body involved. So if you're reading a book and there's a new vocabulary word like exuberant, when you're explaining that, it means really excited. Be really over dramatic with your facial expressions and say exuberant means you're really excited. That is giving more input for the students to help them to understand what's going on. And then we have our little counting tiles, which I'm sure every math teacher or elementary teacher here has seen. These have been around for forever, but they're great multisensory supports.
So then this leads us into functionally equivalent replacement behaviors, or FERBs, not to be confused with Phineas and Ferb, a great TV show that my kids introduced me to. So these teach a different way to access the same type of reinforcement, preferably with a less response effort. It makes it easier for students to engage in the replacement behavior than the problem behavior. It needs to be functionally equivalent to the problem behavior that can result in the same kind of reinforcement or even a higher reinforcement. So that means that what we want to do is we want to teach the student how to communicate with us, and hopefully in a way that's easier than what they were previously performing, and that we are going to reinforce that behavior at the same level or even higher. So if the student's previous way of asking for a glass of water was to throw their cup at me, what I want them to do in working with the speech therapist and knowing their way of communication is either for them to say water, sign water, hand me a picture of water, gesture for water, whatever works for that student. And then, of course, whenever they make any approximation to that response that we're working for, we are going to reinforce that. So here are some verbs that we've added, and the blue, I believe, are the speech ones, and then white are more of the behavioral ones. But as you can see, though, they cross each other because there are ones that are behavioral and speech language communication across. So if you specifically look at escape, appropriate ways to escape, instead of running from the room, which is elopement, asking for a break, that's an appropriate response, a replacement behavior that I would teach as a behavior plan, or as a speech therapist coming in would teach as well. Asking for a different task, asking for help. Those cross each other as a behavior replacement and a communication tool. Access to tangibles, an appropriate request, instead of just grabbing the item out of their peers' hands or grabbing it from where they're not supposed to, making that appropriate request. Of course, we're not going to expect them to come in and, may I please have that toy because I would like to play with it right now? That's not appropriate if the first thing they do is just grab it. So the first thing we might teach them is just to say, play, toy. Again, you're going to base it on what this child's level of communication, their skills, and that's, again, where you collaborate. These are all very much so team efforts. I don't ever work on something that is communication, even though I know it's behavioral. I definitely collaborate with a speech therapist, with an OT, with a PT to find out what that child's skills levels are, so that I'm making sure that I'm not requiring a student to do anything that is well above their ability, because of course, what's that going to result in? More behaviors, because of course that's just going to frustrate the child further, which Gina touched on earlier, that can lead to that. Gina, do you want to add anything?
No, I'm just going to talk about on the next couple of slides. I have some visuals for things that you can use if a student is having difficulty speaking, to be used as replacement behaviors.
Perfect. So you all can see, though, there are different ways to think about, and sometimes you have to get really creative with a replacement behavior. And the other thing that I like to make sure that I talk to people about is that, yes, you always want to have your long-term goal of what is the final goal that you want as your replacement behavior. Of course, if it's that you want the student to ask for an appropriate way to leave the activity or leave the room or go to the bathroom, you can find your long-term goal, and that is to raise their hand, wait for the teacher to call on them, and then go to the door and then get the pass and then walk down the hallway. But if you're talking about a student that is literally just running from the classroom, you are not going to be able to start with step one being all of those steps. So you absolutely can make your long-term goal, but then from there, you have to work yourself back to finding step one of that replacement behavior and starting there. And then you build on those tests, forward chaining, backward chaining. There's plenty of ways to teach it. But I think that sometimes school staff can get very frustrated when they pick that long-term goal and then they just make that first step way too hefty of a goal. The staff get frustrated, the student gets frustrated because it's just not an obtainable goal. Okay, everybody good? No questions or anything? I'm not speaking too fast or getting too crazy? Okay, phew. I'm going to take that as an okay. All right, next one. Functional communication. I believe this is you.
Yeah, so kind of as Amanda was saying, in a perfect world, we want our students to be able to clearly communicate whatever they want in any situation. That might not be the goal for every student depending on their level and age, but that's really what I think about when I think of language. Is I want students to be able to communicate whatever they want to communicate in any situation and know how to appropriately communicate it. But that takes a really long time and a lot of speech and language therapy. And in the meantime, we want something that's simpler for them to get their basic wants and needs met in the classroom. So this can include things like pictures or visuals that a student can point to or hand to the teacher. When it comes to pictures or visuals, if the student is working with a speech language pathologist, they might be using a specific set of visuals or a device where they can touch symbols to communicate. So definitely talk to the speech therapist about that and how you can incorporate it into the classroom. Agreed upon hand gestures, kind of like I was saying in the earlier slide, like a W for water. Something as simple as pointing, using simple rote phrases or words. So I would love the student to say, can I please have a drink of water? But that might be too complicated for that. So can we just start with water and then build from there once the student masters that? Writing on a whiteboard or drawing a picture are also ways that students can communicate their wants and needs. And I have some pictures on the next slide. Some of this is the same as before, but we have these feelings visuals so that students can communicate their feelings if they have trouble with it verbally. This video on the left, this is showing break cards. So you can give a student a card with a picture of a break that they can use when they need a break. You can also use this as a gesture for break. And then I'm going to put these links in the chat. Can you click one more, Amanda? She's going to, I don't know if, I can't hear it.
Oh no. And we are running short on time, so I don't know if you want to share it in the chat and then we can move forward.
Yeah.
But there, oops, sorry. And also, we can, if people want, what we can share, if you want to put our email addresses in the chat as well, they can reach out to us and we can absolutely, because they'll be getting the possibility for the recording, but they can also email us. We can send a PowerPoint of the presentation to them as well. And then that way they can access that way too. But I know we still have a couple slides if people want to bear with us. I know that they might have to duck off, but if they want to finish up with us, we should be done in like maybe 10 more minutes or so. Do you want me to stay on this slide or go to the next one?
You can go to the next one.
Okay.
I just put links in the chat of some really nice resources for visual supports. And then I'm just going to talk quickly about ways that you can help a student's language skills grow in the classroom. First, the first two are the easiest, I think. Repeating a student's utterances, and if they're pronouncing words incorrectly, just repeat it back to them, but emphasize the word that was produced incorrectly and produce it correctly. Additionally, if students are using grammatically incorrect sentences, you can just repeat the sentence back to them with it being grammatically correct, and then pause, give them the opportunity to repeat it, but you don't pressure them to repeat it. These increased models helps the students to learn the appropriate grammar. And you can also use this strategy to help students learn new vocabulary and extend their utterances by adding additions onto the sentence. So if a student says, I like the dog, you can say, I like the big furry dog. So then they can start to get more models of how to add adjectives into sentences. Using read alouds and active reading in the classroom. This could be a presentation in and of itself, but taking the time to do read alouds in class and making sure that you're having before reading, during reading, and after reading activities to help aid with comprehension and engagement. For students who have the difficulties communicating socially, picture books with different social situations, social stories, and video modeling can be used. And I'm going to put links in the chat for that too, with some examples of social stories and video modeling. But this is just kind of showing a student what to expect in different social situations. And then making sure you're giving students opportunities to practice new language skills, doing group projects, having times to do get to know you activities with other students, especially, during the beginning of the year. Encouraging students to introduce themselves to each other during recess and things like that, so that they have the opportunity to practice their language skills.
The other thing I always just like to add from the behavioral perspective is that reinforcement. Whenever a student is making those utterances or you're rephrasing to them and they're still trying and maybe they're incorrect, the one thing we always want to focus on is that even if if you reiterate back to them or rephrase and you're still saying it and they're still getting it incorrect, we never ever want to punish or chastise for them getting it incorrect, because language is something that we can't make a student do. We can't stick our fingers in there and, prompt or physically manipulate. So we never ever want to make it a aversive skill,
Yes.
because that is one that students can actually withhold, and it can cause it to become a negative experience. And so even if a student is struggling, or if they, we want to praise and reward any kind of approximations. And we use differential reinforcement, which means if they're having a really hard day and they're not getting it, you're still going to say, I like how you're trying. Thank you for sticking in there. But then on the next day, when they nail that approximation and they pronounce it and the enunciation sounds amazing, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, that was the best I've ever heard. So the best response gets the best reinforcement. And so you're still reinforcing, because the last thing we would ever want to do is punish a child when they could be trying their hardest, and you just shot that down. Because again, speech is something that we cannot make a child do, and we just would. So sorry, behavior soapbox.
Yes, I'm so glad you added that, Amanda. And that also, language is relational. So you always want to have that relation aspect in mind when a student is trying to communicate, responding as if they are trying to communicate, even if you don't necessarily understand what they're saying, so that they know that those attempts are going to get that relational response.
And it's okay to say if you don't understand a student. I've had to say this before, like, I'm so sorry, I don't understand you. You are trying so hard. Let's go see if we can find an adult that does understand you.
Yes.
And you can apologize. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But what would be more disrespectful is to pretend like you do understand a student, and then that just like, oh, well, now no one's listening to me, I'm just going to stop trying. So just, throwing out those behavioral tidbits again, showing just how much it's on us to adapt, modify our behavior to help continue to increase the student's language. Sorry, Gio.
We're on the same page.
So again, consequence interventions, and these are for, of course, when we're talking about problem behavior, and we're looking at function-based, when it's attention, we don't want to be giving attention to the inappropriate behavior. Please remember, we're ignoring the behavior, not the person. Escape, we follow through with the task. Access to tangibles, we're not going to give them that tangible during the problem behavior. And then sensory stimulation. And again, please remember, these are very general responses. We always want to make sure that before we implement anything, we're talking with our team. If you can get assistance from a behavior analyst, we always want to do that, because I always remember that when we get to sensory, because kids with sensory or self-stimulatory behaviors, it is so specific to each child, because some students you might block or interrupt, and then there are other students that you immediately redirect to a different activity because they need that sensory stimulation. But we also want to remember that not do we just perform a consequence when students do the inappropriate behavior. We have to remember the positive side of consequences, which is when the student does the appropriate replacement behavior instead of the problem behavior. Praise, giving breaks, removal of work, which is actually negative reinforcement. We remove an aversive stimulus. Social time, snaps, drinks, stickers, music, board games, all of those fun things that we do. And I have a coworker from one of my old schools that used to make fun of me for this, that behavior goes where reinforcement flows. You have to remember, what you pay attention to is what's going to increase. So if the inappropriate behavior gets the attention, that's what you're going to see more of. So, and of course with my funny memes, and I say it in my Arnold voice, your questions, give them to me now. So do you guys have any questions at this point in time? And there's our information.
Thanks, guys. That was great.
I'm so sorry, my dog.
That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I am going to put into the chat the link for the Google Forms. Once you fill that out, you will be logged in for getting your Act 48 hours, but you won't get them till the end of the year, because I submit them all in at the end of the year. But I wanted to get that out there. If you guys have questions for Amanda and Gina, please feel free. I am going to stop recording now, though.
Oh, here's a good one.
Hmm.
In the chat. Oh, and of course, my chat's like trying to catch up from